All right, everyone. So I want to talk to you guys about how Israel is ushering in the Antichrist. If you look at what Benjamin Netanyahu said recently, it's very interesting. He told 60 Minutes that eventually Israel will no longer be under American military aid.
Do you believe it's time for the state of Israel to re-examine and possibly reset its financial relationship to the United States, meaning what the United States provides to Israel on an annual basis?
Absolutely. And I've said this to President Trump. I've said it to our own people. Their jaws dropped. But I said, look.
Well, what do you mean? What are you saying?
I want to draw down to zero the American financial support, the financial component of the military cooperation that we have, because we receive $3.8 billion a year. And I think that it's time that we weaned ourselves from the remaining military support.
Can you give me a timetable?
I said, let's start now and do it over the next decade, over the next 10 years, but I want to start now. I don't want to wait for the next Congress. I want to start now. It could go down very fast.
Now, once Israel completely weans itself off from American foreign aid, Israel will go completely mask off. Israel will completely expose its evils in their totality because there will be no reason for Israel to restrain itself. Right now, America, to a certain extent, restrains the Israelis. If you go back to, for example, the year 2019, when Benjamin Netanyahu wanted to annex over 20% of the West Bank, the United States government stopped Israel from doing that. So America does have some restraint on the Israelis. And the reason for this is because America provides military and financial aid to the Israelis, and the Israelis are dependent on this aid. Therefore, the Israelis do follow at least some of America's rules. But if the Israelis want to become completely hardliner, if they want to have the freedom to do whatever it is that they want, including ethnically cleansing or worse, completely genociding the Palestinians, then they're going to have to be completely independent of foreign aid. Now, if the Israelis completely wean themselves away from America's military aid, then the hardliners in Israel will say, well, what is the purpose of following international law? What is the purpose of following America's rules? What is the purpose of having any restraint? We are no longer under any foreign aid, and therefore we are no longer under any foreign country's control. And so if we want to completely take over the Gaza Strip and the West Bank and transform these regions into dystopian Jewish smart cities, then we should be able to do that. And so once the Israelis are completely off of foreign aid, they will completely expose their evilness in its complete form. And the Israelis will become a complete hardliner state. The fanatics, the radicals, the far right, they will be in complete control. Right now, you have these more Western-inclined Israelis who say, if we are going to get the support of the West, then we need to calm down, we need to have restraint. But if there is no Western support to the Israelis, then the hardliners will say, hey, what is the purpose of following Western rules? What is the purpose of following America's rules when we are not getting anything from America? And so Israel will go completely mask off. And so once Israel becomes a complete hardliner and fanatical state, the Israelis will begin to pursue their vision of building a third temple. Now, to be fair, not all Israelis want for a third temple to be built, but there is nonetheless a substantial population within Israel that does want to have a third temple. And if the Israelis begin to actually construct this third temple, and if they complete this third temple, if they complete the building of this third temple, then Israel will officially become a theocracy. Once that happens, the Israeli government will become really a co-Sharia state, wherein the state will be imposing a kosher law, hence the term co-Sharia law. It's a little play on words there. I take the word kosher and the word Sharia, I put the two words together, and you have co-Sharia law, which is really just my way of describing the imposition of Jewish halakhic law. And so once that happens, then you will have really just this fanatical Jewish state with a third temple, and it's going to be completely masked off.
אנחנו נגרש אותם מאדמתנו, כי פה זה אדמתנו, ולבנון זה אדמתנו, ועזה זה שלנו, ואין מצב שאנחנו לא נגרש אותם הטמאים האלה שהם מחללים יום ויום את הר הבית ואת ירושלים בכל מקום שהם דוחים. אנחנו נגרש אותם מפה. הרצל אמר אם תרצו אין זו אגדה. אנחנו אומרים היום שתרצו או לא תרצו אין זו אגדה. זה לא אגדה כי אנחנו נעיף אתכם מפה. בואו נגמור את העבודה, אנחנו רוצים לגמור את העבודה.
Now, the fanatical hardliners in Israel will say now it's time to ethnically cleanse, or worse, completely genocide the Palestinians. The Palestinians will be horrifically persecuted, more so than they are already. And the Muslim world will be calling for a hero. Now, who are they going to be calling for? They're going to be calling for the strongest of the Muslim countries to rise up to militarily intervene for the Palestinians. And really, they will be calling for the entirety of the Islamic world to rise up to save their Muslim brothers and sisters in the West Bank and Gaza. And Islamic countries will rise up. You already have the two strongest Islamic countries, Turkey and Iran. Iran is already at war with Israel. Turkey has been seriously talking about a war with Israel, and Turkey has made it very clear that they are actually preparing for direct hostilities with the Israelis. Hence why the Turkish government has developed something called the Gazap bomb. And if you ever see the Gazap bomb, it's pretty terrifying. It's the word Gaza with the letter P at the end. So it's Gaza, G-A-Z-A, with a P at the end, the Gazap bomb. And so I think eventually the Turks are going to be looking at the Israelis and they're going to be saying, okay, you destroyed Gaza, now it's time for you to be Gazapped. And if you ever see the Gazap bomb, you can see how terrifying it is. Just imagine some of these bombs dropping on Tel Aviv. The Turks will definitely have the capabilities to utterly devastate the Israelis. And so in ushering in their fanaticism, in their intensification and in their growing of their own fanaticism, the Israelis are getting closer and closer to the spirit of Antichrist, and they are getting closer to really ushering in at least an Antichrist, and they are getting closer to ushering in their own demise, because if they become completely fanatical and if they worsen in their violence towards the Palestinians and they resort to trying to completely exterminate the Palestinians, they will eventually have to face the ferocity of the Islamic world, and the Israelis will be facing their end. And if they pursue this vision of a third temple, then eventually some bamboozler will rise up and say, I am the Jewish Messiah.
And one day our true leader will come and we'll be united as a whole Jewish nation so we can rebuild the Beit HaMikdash. But until then, what makes us unique is we're that one nation who believes in one God, which ultimately makes the reason why Am Yisrael Chai. Shabbat Shalom to the Jewish people.
I am the Messiah for the Jewish people. I'm not Jesus who the Goyim follow. That's the false Messiah that all these Goys follow. No. I am the true Jewish Messiah. And the Jews, many of them at least, will follow this guy just like they followed Bar Kokhba. And there was a rabbi at the time of Bar Kokhba. His name was Rabbi Akiva. He was considered to be the topmost scholar of his day. And he said, yes, Bar Kokhba is the Messiah. And so they rejected Jesus and they followed the false Messiah Bar Kokhba. And today people in Israel reject Christ and they will spit on you for just being a Christian. and they will follow the Bar Kokhba of the future, and you're going to have your Rabbi Akivas rising up saying, oh yes, this is the Messiah. Now, it's very, very funny, and it's kind of ironic that you will argue with Jewish people today, you will argue with religious Jewish people today, and they will say, well, the reason why we reject Jesus is because, and they'll give you the whole list, as to why they reject Christ. And they will say, well, the reason why the Jews rejected Christ is because of all of these reasons. And this is why our sages and our rabbis rejected Christ. So your sages and your rabbis and your topmost intellectuals rejected Christ, but yet your topmost intellectuals embraced Bar Kokhba, who was a false Messiah, and he led a war against the Roman Empire. And the Roman Empire went into Judea and unleashed hell on the Judeans and butchered hundreds of thousands of Judeans. And this led to the destruction of Judea. And so if you followed Christ, if your people just had followed Christ, you guys would have said, hey, we are now followers of Christ. We honor God, but we also obey the laws when the laws are just. And you guys would not have ended up like your ancestors did when they were following Bar Kokhba. And so the Jews back in the day, they rose up against the Roman Empire in their hubris and in their arrogance and in their self-deceit. They said, we're going to follow Bar Kokhba. And they went to war against the Roman Empire, and they believed that they were going to win. That's the thing. They believed wholeheartedly that victory was going to be obtained because they believed that God was on their side because they followed this book called the War Scroll. And if you ever look at the Dead Sea Scrolls, there is a text, albeit we do not possess this text in its totality. We have fragments of this text. We have more than fragments. We have most of this book in its entirety. We are missing some parts, but nonetheless, you can go online and you can read the War Scroll, at least what we have left of the War Scroll. And it talks about how there's going to be this apocalyptic war in which the Jews are going to rise up and they will go to war against all of the sons of Shem except for the Hebrews. So according to the War Scroll, the Jews are going to rise up with this massive army and they're going to go to war against all of the Semitic family who are not Jewish, who aren't Hebrews. And after so many years, eventually they will completely wipe out the non-Jewish Semites. Then, after destroying all of the Semites who aren't Jewish, the Jews will then go to war against all of the sons of Ham. So these are basically your African peoples. And the War Scroll says that after some years, eventually the Jews will completely destroy and vanquish the sons of Ham. And then, after destroying the sons of Ham, the mighty Jewish nation will go to war against all of the sons of Japheth. These are your European peoples. And then it says, after so many years, eventually the Jewish nation, the mighty, powerful Jewish nation, and its massive, powerful Semitic army with its Levitical priests will completely, utterly destroy and vanquish and annihilate all of the children of Japheth, all of the Europeans. So they took this War Scroll and they said, hey, victory's on our side. We're going to go against these Goyim. And they went to war against the Roman Empire. And they lost. And hundreds of thousands of Judeans were butchered. They were massacred. And so they really ushered in their own demise. But before they ushered in their own demise, they ushered in the spirit of Antichrist. They followed Bar Kokhba, who was not the Antichrist, but he was definitely an Antichrist. And they did not heed the warning of Jesus Christ. They did not heed to what Jesus Christ warned them about. Jesus Christ said that there will be false messiahs. There will be many people who will come and say that they are the Messiah, that they are the Christ. Do not follow them. Well, Bar Kokhba was one of those false messiahs, and they followed Bar Kokhba. So they ushered in this spirit of Antichrist. Oh, and I almost forgot to mention, they also talked about rebuilding the temple because the Bar Kokhba revolt took place after the destruction of the second temple. So they had this vision of rebuilding the temple, creating a third temple. And this is one of the things that Bar Kokhba promised. Bar Kokhba said, well, we will rebuild the third temple. So in their pursuit, in their envisage of creating a third temple, they ushered in the spirit of Antichrist. And in ushering in the spirit of Antichrist, they ushered in their own demise. And one of the things that Bar Kokhba decreed was that anyone who followed Christ will be killed. If you ever read, for example, Eusebius's Ecclesiastical History, he talks about this, how when Bar Kokhba took over Judea with his revolutionary government, he decreed that whoever follows the Nazarene, meaning Jesus Christ, will be killed. This is what he said. And so if the Israelis go fully fanatical, if they go full hardliner, and if they go full co-Sharia law, and they start pursuing this dream of rebuilding the temple and creating a third temple, rest assured that they will pursue this idea of slaughtering Christians. They will go after Christians completely. Now, right now, they will beat up Christians. For example, there's a video you can see of some Jewish fanatic beating up a French nun. They will, of course, spit on Christians. This is very, very common. This is not a rarity. This is not an anomaly. I know that that one guy, what's his name? I forget. Mr. Tatum, he told Benjamin Netanyahu, man, we was in Israel and we only got spit on one time, man, just one time. And that meme is a meme for a reason. It's because according to the evangelical Zionists, just being spat upon one time, well, that's a good day in Israel. And so being spat on and being beaten up, these are common occurrences, especially the spitting part. But if the Israelis go full hardliner, they will actually pursue a policy of exterminating Christians and killing people who follow Jesus Christ.
זה בסדר לירוק על נוצרים. אם הם עובדי עבודה זרה, אז אנחנו צריכים למוס בהם ולשקט אותם ולרמוס אותם ובעיקרון גם להרוג אותם, כי הרי גוי חייב בשם המצוות בלי נוח, ואם הוא לא מקיים את זה צריך להרוג אותו. אבל... אתה תהרוג מישהו? אם הייתי יכול, הייתי מאוד שמח לעשות את זה, אבל אין לנו בית דין, אז אנחנו לא יכולים לעשות את זה. אוקיי. אבל זה אמונה של מישהו אחר. זה אמונה שמישהו מאמין בה צריך להרוג אותו.
מי שמאמין שהאלוהים שלי הוא חלק מאיש, אז צריך להרוג אותו. מי שמזלזל באלוהים שלי, אז אני אהרוג אותו.
One thing you also have to keep in mind is in the radicalization of Israel, Israel right now is going through a massive brain drain. This has been one of the biggest fears of the moderates in Israel, that Israel will go through a brain drain. And that's exactly what's been happening right now in Israel since 2023. Tens of thousands of Israelis have been fleeing Israel. And this trend has been going on, like I said, since 2023. And it was going on actually before even the 10/7 attack. And the reason why it was going on even before then is because before Hamas attacked Israel in 2023, the fanatics in Israel, the fanatics in the Knesset, were beginning to pursue this policy of completely overhauling the Israeli Supreme Court. And the reason for this is because they want to remove the power of the Supreme Court and give complete power to the Knesset. That way they can just fill up the Knesset with fanatics and then pass kosher laws and not have to worry about the Supreme Court hindering the imposition of those hardliner rules, of those fanatical laws. So, for example, they wanted to make a law that would make it illegal for people to preach Jesus Christ in Israel. That law did not pass. Netanyahu actually struck it down. And the reason why Netanyahu struck it down is because, well, Israel receives foreign aid from the United States. So you can imagine if Israel starts to persecute people for preaching Jesus Christ, that would look very bad for the Americans to be supporting a government that does that. So this is the reason why Israel has some restraint. Take out American foreign aid, Israel will go mask off. But imagine if that law got passed and there was no Supreme Court to hinder the imposition of that law. There was no Supreme Court to strike such a law down. So without the Supreme Court being there to impede the vision of the fanatics have really no leash. They have no control, no constraints, and they will be able to impose whatever laws that they want. And so this is the reason why they want to remove the power of the Supreme Court. Well, the Israeli Knesset, various members in the Netanyahu government were beginning to pursue this vision of overhauling the Supreme Court. This caused massive political instability in Israel, and that is when the brain drain actually began. Then after the 10/7 attack, the brain drain intensified. After Iran and Israel had their first spat in 2024, the brain drain intensified, and then during and after the 12-day war, that brain drain got even bigger. And then right now, the brain drain is still ongoing because Israel and Iran are still technically at war, albeit there is a ceasefire. But you see, this brain drain is taking place, which means that the intelligent people are leaving. That's what brain drain means. If you look at the people who are fleeing Israel, it's the people who are more educated. It's your engineers. It's the people who are in the medical field. It's those types of people. It's the more educated peoples of Israel. Now, if enough of those people leave, then Israel will have a much higher concentration of fanatics, because the people who are voting for more moderate politicians tend to be the more educated. Remove those people, then what you will have left is a massive political vacuum that the fanatics will fill up. You will be left with a vacant political space that the fanatics will occupy. And the fanatics will have more political power because with less educated people, with less moderately political people, that means that there will be more votes for the political fanatics and less votes for the moderates, thereby giving a more solid road to victory for the fanatics in Israel. And so Israel right now is continuously getting closer and closer to becoming a complete kosher law state. Now, once those fanatics take over, or, to be more careful, because I don't want to be overly emphatic in my predictions, so I will be more conservative in how I express my predictions. If Israel becomes a complete hardliner state, it will begin to pursue this idea of a third temple, and it will pursue much more violently the vision of either completely ethnically cleansing the Palestinians out, or worse, utterly genociding them, or really both at the same time, because a country can definitely do genocide and ethnic cleansing at the same time. And so that's what we can expect for the Israeli state if it continues down this path of radicalization. And so right now, the reason why, really the only reason as to why the Israelis have some restraint is because of foreign aid. Once that foreign aid is no longer there, then the Israelis are going to say, okay, what's the purpose of even following any sort of rules? What's the purpose of following America's demands? We're just going to do whatever the hell it is that we want. And so that's what we can expect for an Israel that has weaned itself off from American military aid. Now, it's very interesting. Why is Netanyahu saying that eventually the Israelis will become independent of American military aid? I think it's because Netanyahu sees the writing on the wall.
Anti-Semitism, this vile vilification of the Jews, took a reprieve after the Holocaust. Took a reprieve. It took 80 years. It wasn't fashionable to be anti-Semitic, so you didn't say these things in polite society. But it's come back. It's almost like it accompanies us throughout.
What is that about, Mr. Prime Minister?
I think
because I want to stop you right there, because in my career, which started in 1990 in Washington, up until very recently, it was an established fact in Congress. Established fact. The Republicans and Democrats had a default proposition favorable to Israel. Not always, not universally, but a default proposition that began with yes. That's not true anymore. That's less true than at any other time I've covered Washington. That has to be reflective of something else.
Yes, it is. Well, these are historical cycles, which
So
my
you're in a
father.
historical cycle.
Yes, we are. I mean, anti-Semitism is.
It had been flowed, yes.
But it had been flowed, but it flowed throughout our history, and the reason it.
But America's not a place where things like that tend to come back.
Well, they can come back. They were there in the 1930s
Yes.
with Father Coughlin, and they ebbed because of the war, but it's come back.
if you look at the Pew Research Center's polling of how Americans feel about Israel, going all the way back to 2025, last year, and if you look at what the research has been saying for this year, it's quite obvious that the trajectory for the American people's feelings towards Israel is quite negative and continues to become more negative every single month. And so in 2025, Pew Research said that I think it was 53% of Americans have a negative view towards Israel, and that was back in, I want to say, April of 2025. And then fast forward to October of 2025, Pew Research Center said that the number of Americans who have a negative view towards Israel was at, I want to say, 59%. And right now, it's even higher. And so the number of Americans hating on Israel and having a negative view towards Israel are growing, and that number will continue to grow. And so the Israelis see the writing on the wall. Netanyahu sees the writing on the wall, and he is saying, okay, we're going to have to get off American aid. We're going to have to become more independent because the political landscape of the United States is becoming more and more hostile towards Israel. And there's going to come a time where we're going to have to be completely self-sufficient. And so I think the Israelis are just seeing the writing on the wall, and they know that they're going to have to become completely independent because eventually the Americans will throw the Israelis under the bus, and then Israel will have no choice but to be self-sufficient. So I'm guessing the Israelis are just preparing for that moment. And I think it's quite obvious that that moment is coming. Now, the Israelis are declaring their vision, their plan to become completely independent of American support within this greater global political climate of nationalism. Nationalism right now is dominating all political discourse. And if you look at how the world is right now, I mean, it's quite obvious that we're becoming more and more nationalistic. And this trend of nationalism in America was, of course, beginning to be seen in 2014, 15, 16, with the rise of the MAGA movement, with people saying, America first, make America great again. Now, a lot of people started becoming nationalistic when Obama was president in his second term. That's when I really started noticing it. So you had ISIS, you had mass terrorism, you had Christians being massacred, and this was a massive reason as to why a lot of people started really hating Obama. They said, look at this disaster in the Middle East, look at all of this killing, all of this butchery, it's horrific. You got these Islamic fanatics in the Middle East, and they're burning people alive, and they're beheading people, and they're drowning people, and they're running people over with tanks, and they're hanging people on meat hooks, and it's just a freaking nightmare. It's like the movie Saw became a reality. And so a lot of people said, hey, this is happening under Obama's watch, therefore this is Obama's fault. Now, another thing that started happening a lot during Obama's second term was mass migration, especially mass migration into Europe, because of all of the violence that was taking place in Syria and Iraq, violence that was really a product of American/NATO policy. You had mass migration from the Middle East into Europe. You had around 1 million or so migrants, mainly from the Middle East, going to Europe, and most of those migrants settled in Germany. We're talking somewhere around 800,000 or so migrants, or something like that. We'll just say hundreds of thousands of migrants went into Germany and settled there. And you had Angela Merkel saying this is great, and she made her infamous "We can do it" declaration. She said, "We can do it, we can handle this." And so you had this massive migrant crisis that began in late 2014, but it really took off in 2015. And it just became a worse and worse political situation for the Germans, because they got a lot of German people to become very angry at the Christian democratic government that was ruling. And so you had the rise of nationalism, right-wing politics began to become more popular in Germany. And so what really began to rise in the latter time of Obama's second term was nationalism. And then you had the rise of Brexit. Brexit happened, and Brexit was a direct result of this global phenomenon of nationalism. Brexit was directly sparked by the migrant crisis in Europe, because Boris Johnson came out and said, well, if you don't vote for Brexit, then all these migrants are going to be taking over all of England. And so they voted for Brexit, and that meant voting to sever Great Britain from the European Union. Now, what's interesting, and this is something that wasn't really known until recently, it's that Jeffrey Epstein was a massive fan of Brexit. And a lot of these big elites were actually massive fans of Brexit. So, for example, we have an email from Jeffrey Epstein, and this can be read in the big Epstein emails database that the U.S. government put together. And in this email, Jeffrey Epstein is writing to Peter Thiel, and he says, Brexit is only the beginning. And Peter Thiel says, the beginning of what? And Epstein says, it's the beginning of the end of the global order. It's the beginning of the end of globalism. It's the beginning of the rise of nationalism and tribalism. And so a lot of conservatives all conservatives really hate Jeffrey Epstein. I mean, only a psychopath loves Jeffrey Epstein. But a lot, you have these conservatives who say, oh yeah, we have the Epstein class, and they associate the Epstein class with being anti-nationalism. But the really ironic thing is that the opposite is actually the reality. Jeffrey Epstein was pro-nationalism. He wanted to revive nationalism, and he wanted to revive tribalism. And so that leads me to the conclusion that, well, you have these tech elites, these techno-fascists who really loved Brexit. Now, of course, you have your elites who hated Brexit, but the point is that Jeffrey Epstein loved Brexit. Now, you have these conservatives who will say, well, Epstein, that's part of the anti-nationalist elite. But you're wrong. Now, I understand that you have your elites who did not want Brexit. I'm not disagreeing with that. But the fact is that the number one elite that conservatives are outraged by the most, Jeffrey Epstein, was very supportive of Brexit, which was something that conservatives, including their great leader, Donald Trump, was very excited about. So the number one elite that conservatives hate the most, Jeffrey Epstein, was also excited about the very thing that the entirety of the conservative world was excited about, and that is Brexit. And so that really tells us something here, that Brexit was a part of a greater scheme. It was a part of a greater plan. And I want to connect the dots here because I know I began this video by talking about Benjamin Netanyahu. So you're thinking, okay, what does this have to do with Benjamin Netanyahu? I'm going to get to that. This has to do with something that is greater than Benjamin Netanyahu. Benjamin Netanyahu is just one figurehead in this massive political monster. He's just one cog in this horrific leviathan of a political machine. There is a connection between Jeffrey Epstein and Israel. That is a fact that has been established. I don't have to really get into serious detail about this, but we all know that Ehud Barak and Jeffrey Epstein were very close. We all know that Jeffrey Epstein would go out and visit Ehud Barak, and he visited Ehud Barak many, many times. We all know that Epstein's girlfriend, Ghislaine Maxwell, was the daughter of a massive Mossad leader by the name of Robert Maxwell. It's all very, very well established. Jeffrey Epstein was a Zionist. Jeffrey Epstein was also a eugenist. And so here you have Jeffrey Epstein, who's this guy who was well-connected in Israel, well-connected with all these elites, well-connected to all these politicians, and he is praising Brexit. He wants Brexit, which means that he was very excited about nationalism, and he made this very clear. He was excited about this revival in nationalism. And Brexit was definitely a reflection of this. And so what do you see being done here? You see this Zionist, Jeffrey Epstein, getting excited about nationalism. And there was a trend, especially in the 2010s, of Zionists supporting nationalism. For example, there was a very big magazine called Front Page Magazine. It was one of the biggest right-wing magazines in the world, definitely one of the biggest in the United States. And it was started by a guy named David Horowitz of the Horowitz Freedom Center. And Horowitz's media operation was funded by, what's his name? Bob Shillman. You can't make this up, right? Bob Shillman was a massive Zionist who was also funding Tommy Robinson. He massively funded Geert Wilders' a political campaign for 2017. He also has backed figureheads like Laura Loomer. So there is definitely this Zionist elite, Jeffrey Epstein was included in this circle, who supports nationalism and wants for this nationalist uprising to take place. And so you saw this massive wave of nationalism blow up in 2014, 15, 16, 17. And Brexit was the result of this, or Brexit was one of the fruits of this. The rise of Trump was a massive fruit of this, a massive product of this. But Donald Trump was a Zionist. So you had in this early part of this explosion of nationalism a Zionist element and a Zionist connection. And right now you see that you have these Jewish people in Florida. They erected this golden statue of Donald Trump, which is just insane. And in this ultra-nationalist uprising, you have this desire for nationalist independence. So if you look at the beginning of this nationalist phenomenon, which began in the mid-2010s, 14, 15, 16, and then carried on into 2017, and then it was kind of put in the back burner by the 2020 COVID crisis, you had these nationalists who were very popular, and they weren't really talking so much about Israel. You know, being anti-Israel really wasn't a huge thing in 2015, 16, 17. What was massively popular was this idea of sovereignty. It was this idea of putting your nation first. And this is where we get the term America First. And this is where we get the term Make America Great Again. And when the MAGA movement first rose up, it was still overwhelmingly pro-Israel. It was still overwhelmingly pro-Israel. And when the nationalist movement rose up in Europe with the AfD, Geert Wilders, the Brexit movement, the Sweden Democrats, these guys weren't really vocal about Israel either. I mean, you may have had some voices here and there, but for one thing, Geert Wilders is a Zionist. The AfD party does have, it definitely has anti-Israel elements, and those elements are getting louder. But initially, back in 14, 15, 16, 17, the AfD wasn't really being seriously vocal against Israel. The British nationalists don't really talk so much about Israel, especially when you look at the Nigel Farage movement. They don't really get into Israel. But they talked a lot about putting their nations first. Nationalism. Okay. And the Israelis weren't really expressing that much fear about this. They thought, okay, yeah, put your nation first. Great, wonderful, who cares? And they were, to a great extent, supporting it. I mean, for example, you can't sever Donald Trump and the rise of Donald Trump from the Israelis. The Israelis still love Donald Trump. But what was an inevitable result of putting your nations first? The inevitable result was going to be a hostility towards Israel. That was going to be the inevitable result all along in this phenomenon of putting your nation first. So let's take America, for example. We had the MAGA movement, rose up, make America great again, America first, great, wonderful. And the Shapiroites and the Mark Levinites, you know, you have Mark Levine and you have Mr. Shapiro. They didn't really mind this because the movement wasn't really hostile towards Israel. And they said, okay, yeah, put America first. That could also mean going to war against Iran because, you know, as they say, Iran is a threat to America. So putting America first would be also going to war against Iran. Even if it means going to war for Israel, you know, it's still America first. But once Americans started thinking about America first, they automatically began to think about foreign interference in American politics. Foreign interference. Not only that, but our tax dollars going to other countries. And this was the number one reason why America's support for Ukraine was so unpopular. It's because we were just pouring in billions and billions and billions of dollars into Ukraine. And the Ukrainians were still losing. And so the American people said, I have difficulty paying for gas and for rent and for groceries. And yet Ukraine gets another multi-billion-dollar foreign aid package. What gives? And once you saw that anger towards giving aid to Ukraine, anger towards Israel was an inevitability. It was something that was going to happen no matter what. Because the biggest receiver of American foreign aid is not Ukraine, it's Israel. And so people began to say, well, we're giving all this money to Ukraine, but we're giving even more money to Israel. Why are we doing this? And you began to see the tide turning against Israel. And even before Israel started to make Gaza into a human slaughterhouse in 2023, the tide was already turning against Israel. I think by the year 2022, the percentage of Americans who had a negative view towards Israel was somewhere around 40 or 44%. So the number was rising even before the Gaza slaughterhouse began. But the Gaza slaughterhouse acted as the first major catalyst towards really shifting the tide against Israel amongst the American population. So you had the Gaza slaughterhouse, and that got 80+% of the American Democrats to be against Israel. Before, the majority of Democrats would support Israel. I mean, not exactly before, but for quite a long time, the Democrat Party, as in terms of the civilians, were very pro-Israel. Democrats, by and large, at one point in time, were very pro-Israel. But now the number of Democrats who are pro-Israel are an extremely small minority. And like I said, over 80% of the Democrat civilian population in the United States hate Israel. But even then, the Israelis still had the Republicans. And now we're seeing a massive shift within the Republican civilian population against Israel. And now if you look at Republican Americans who are under the age of 50, the majority of those people are against Israel. If you look at millennial Republicans, the majority of those people are against Israel. The only reason why the majority of Republican American civilians are pro-Israel is because of the boomer generation. Once those people go, it's over. So this rising tide in nationalism, which is something that Epstein and the Epstein class has supported and still supports, is actually something that is leading to the demise of Israel. So Epstein said, now Epstein, hey, he was this big Zionist. He was friends with Ehud Olmert. Or Ehud Barak. Big Zio. He was well connected to Peter Thiel, who was a major figurehead in the techno-fascist elite circle in the United States. And he was supporting nationalism, just like Peter Thiel today is supporting nationalism, just like Elon Musk today is supporting nationalism. So another example of Zionists supporting nationalism is Yoram Hazony. Yoram Hazony is the president of one of the biggest Zionist organizations in the world, and that is the Herzl Institute. He has been extremely vocal about his support for nationalism, and he in fact wrote an entire book on why we should all support nationalism. And so Zionists have been very much so behind nationalism and this recent surge in nationalism. But you see, this is where the synagogue, the temple, Israel, begins to foment and to usher in its own demise. Because once you have nationalism, it's like it's a genie out of the bottle situation. You find the magic lamp. You think it's great that you found the magic lamp. You discovered the magic lamp. You start rubbing the magic lamp. And then the genie, the jinn, which is really just an Arabic word for demon, the demon is out of the bottle. You know, they say, oh, the genie is out. No. I like to be more explicit and accurate to the Arabic language here. Jinn means demon. The demon is out of the lamp. You have rubbed the magic lamp. The demon came out and said, okay, give me your 3 wishes. You wish to have power and fame and prestige, and then you sell your own soul, and then before you know it, you're in hell. You are in the clutches of the devil himself. And so this is what Israel has done. They said, well, we need to have nationalism. Okay, here, we have nationalism. Oh, well, I didn't mean this kind of nationalism that's anti-Israel. What the hell did you expect to happen? Once people become nationalistic, they start talking about sovereignty, independence, stopping foreign influence. And that got the Americans to think, wait a second, we have this massive Israel lobby. They started reading John Mearsheimer's book on the Israel lobby, which is an excellent read, by the way. And they started noticing, wow, there's this thing called Israel, and there's this entity called AIPAC, and there's this other thing called the Israel lobby, which is really just a part of AIPAC. And they have a lot of influence over our politicians, and they see their politicians, their Congress members, listening to Benjamin Netanyahu speaking, and they're giving standing ovations for Netanyahu, and they're giving more standing ovations to Netanyahu than they would the President of the United States himself. They see all of this stuff, and they think, wow, there's a lot of foreign influence here. Why in the hell is so much money going to this thing called Israel? Why do we have to care about what Israel wants? Why is the Vice President, J.D. Vance, always calling up Benjamin Netanyahu to inform him about what's happening with the conflict with the Iranians? Why did we do this war with Iran? What was the purpose of doing this whole war of choice? Then they read the New York Times article on how Donald Trump got convinced to spark this war. They read about how Benjamin Netanyahu and the head of the Mossad went to the White House. They were hanging out with Donald Trump, and how the head of the Mossad, Mr. What's his name, Barnea or whatever, he told Donald Trump that they can do a regime change very quickly because the people of Iran are with America and the people of Iran will rise up and all this stuff. And Trump got convinced of this, and he said, okay, let's do this. And so they read the New York Times article, and they just see one word, Israel. That's it. And they're like, okay, why are we in this bullshit war? Why am I paying $4 a gallon for gas? Well, oh, because we got the Strait of Hormuz is getting blocked. But the Strait of Hormuz was not blocked before this war, so why do we have to have a war? It wasn't blocked. So now we're talking about continuing this war to get it unblocked, but it wasn't blocked before, so why in the hell did we do this war, which led to it being blocked in the first place? Oh, it's this thing called Israel, guys, Israel. And so Americans have Israel fatigue. And so there's this rise in nationalism inevitably was going to lead to people hating Israel. So all of you Zios, just like Jeffrey Epstein before he died, you guys wanted nationalism, and now you are facing your own demise because Americans have wakened up to Israel's influence, and now the majority of Americans, for the first time since the establishment of the State of Israel, are against Israel. They're anti-Israel. And now, for the first time ever, the vast majority of Americans are more pro-Palestine than they are pro-Israel. Things are a-changing, as the song says, and so what's going to happen? So in this context of this global phenomenon of nationalism, Israel sees the writing on the wall and says, okay, we have to now wean ourselves away from America's teat. Once that happens, once Israel is no longer under any sort of constraint by American foreign aid, then the Israelis will say, okay, you moderate Israelis who were telling us that we have to be moderate and we have to be constrained in order to guarantee American foreign aid, we no longer have to listen to you. What was the purpose of having rules of engagement? What was the purpose of it all? What is the purpose of it all? Let's go full on Third Temple psycho mode. And the Third Temple demons are going to show themselves. And now, right now, Israel is already possessed by Third Temple demons, don't get me wrong, but it's like what Jesus said. This generation is like a man who was possessed by one demon, the demon leaves his body, and then comes back with 7 more. So it will be with this generation, and I'm going to say the same thing about Israel today. Yes, Israel is already possessed by Third Temple demons, but more demons are going to possess it, and those demons are going to be showing their full faces because it'll be masked off. And so right now you're seeing the demonism of Israel exposing itself. We've been seeing this for years now, I know, but it's getting more and more revealing and more telling, especially when you look at the fact that now you have the Israelis using dogs to rape Palestinian men, Palestinian detainees at the State Taman prison camp. It's a prison camp, but it's really a house of horrors. And it's where the Third Temple demons get to engage and get to indulge in their sadistic desires. It's horrific. And the State Taman prison camp really is just a presaging sign of what Israel will be in its full form in the future, and it's only going to get worse. And so this is what we can expect. So you had this rise in nationalism, which was supported by the Epstein class, and is still being supported by the Epstein class, Peter Thiel and the like, Alex Karp and the like. Oh, that's another example. Alex Karp, who is a big major Zionist. He is a massive business partner of Peter Thiel for the company Palantir, and he really gets a lot of glee and pleasure from watching Gaza being destroyed and Palestinians being killed. I mean, the guy is an evil sadist. He's demonic.
You need a higher purpose, and I also think you often need a lower purpose. Like the higher purpose for me...
What's a lower purpose?
Well, I love the idea of getting a drone and having light fentanyl-laced urine spraying on analysts who tried to screw us. So that's my lower purpose. And, and others. But the higher purpose for me was to get this nation to be the preeminent power in the world, because whatever faults we have, they're nothing like anyone else's.
But Alex Karp, who is a Zionist, is also very supportive of this global rise in nationalism. And he made this quite obvious when he said just recently that it's time for Germany and Japan to intensify their remilitarization. And we see Germany intensely pursuing remilitarization with much enthusiasm and much exuberance. And at the same time, you have this massive rise in nationalism in Germany that is accompanying this massive rise in militarism. And for one thing, you can't have remilitarization without nationalism. The two are hand in glove. And so you have Alex Karp, a Zionist in the tech world, massive figurehead in the tech world, supporting this rise in German and Japanese nationalism and militarism. And so you had this rise in nationalism. Jeffrey Epstein supported it. Peter Thiel and his ilk, they support it. And in this global phenomenon of nationalism, in this political climate of nationalism, rose alongside with it this awakening to the influence of Israel and Israel's influence. And it got a lot of people to say, okay, we're sick and tired of Israel's foreign influence on our country. And so this has helped to act as a catalyst in this shift against Israel in the Western world. And so now the Israelis are closer to their own demise. So with this desire to no longer be with Israel, with this desire of countries to sever themselves from Israel, the Israelis are now going to become more fanatical because they're going to say the world has abandoned us. And then once they go full Bar Kokhba mode, they will also become more and more explicitly genocidal, which will lead to Israel having to face the ferocity of the Islamic world, especially countries like Turkey and Iran, and Israel will be facing its demise. Now, in the post-World War II world, nationalism really wasn't a thing. If you look at America, if you look at Europe was... Europeans back in the day, decades ago, they voted for politically centrist parties like Christian Democrats, Social Democrats, etc. And then if you look at the United States, America was more politically moderate decades ago because America at least was trying to maintain the global order that it's been leading since the end of the Second World War. But then 9/11 happens. And what happens as a result of 9/11? You have Iraq. Now, 9/11 is very interesting because it was done by Al-Qaeda, and Al-Qaeda at that time was a proxy of the United States. It was really a proxy of the American empire. If you don't believe me, just look at what the Americans were doing with Al-Qaeda when it came to going against the Soviets. America was backing the Mujahideen against the Soviets, which led to the rise of Al-Qaeda. And then if you fast forward to the 1990s, you had Al-Qaeda in southern Russia helping to lead the Chechen and Dagestani insurgency against the Russian government, and a civil war broke out in the 1990s between the Chechens and the Dagestanis on one side and the Russians on the other, and it was a very, very bloody civil war, and horrific massacres occurred and people were beheaded. Well, what that led to was a flood of al-Qaeda operatives going into southern Russia, going into Chechnya and Dagestan to support these Muslims against the Russians. And NATO supported this. In fact, there was a meeting between the U.S. government and Saudi Arabia in which Saudi Arabia agreed to actually support the Chechen Mujahideen against the Russians. And also there was an agreement that was coordinated between the United States government and Al-Qaeda and the Azerbaijani government, in which Azerbaijan agreed to allow for Azerbaijan to be a central headquarters for Al-Qaeda operatives to meet up to prepare to go against the Russians, because Azerbaijan borders right with Russia. So there was definitely support for Al-Qaeda coming from the United States against the Russians. Supporting Al-Qaeda was a part of U.S. foreign policy. And another great example, or another great sign of America's support for Al-Qaeda, is the fact that Ahmed al-Sharaa is currently ruling over Syria. Ahmed al-Sharaa was ushered in by the United States because the U.S. government wants Al-Qaeda to rule Syria. America and Israel overthrew the Bashar al-Assad government, which was much more moderate than Al-Qaeda, quite obviously. That really goes without saying. But the Israelis and the Americans wanted Al-Qaeda to take over Syria to throw out any Iranian influence and really Russian influence in that country. So that's another sign of America's support for Al-Qaeda, and it's another indication of how supporting Al-Qaeda is actually part of American foreign policy. So going back to the 1990s, America was supporting Al-Qaeda, and then you had 9/11 in 2001. And even during the 9/11 attacks, America was still backing Al-Qaeda and the Mujahideen against the Russians. And so here was America supporting Al-Qaeda, and then at the same time, Al-Qaeda attacks the United States. So it really leads one to question, was 9/11 something that just ambushed the highest echelons of American power, or was 9/11 also a part of foreign policy? Because 9/11, and it goes back to that whole question of, cui bono, who benefits, right? What did 9/11 enable? As tragic as 9/11 was, what did 9/11 enable? It enabled the Iraq War, which was something that the Zionists had wanted for years, going all the way back to the 1990s. If you go, for example, to the Clean Break Memo, it was written by people like Douglas Faith and Richard Pearl, David Wormser, Meirav Wormser, Robert Lowenberg. These guys, they're all Zionists, and what they were asking for in the Clean Break Memo was for the overthrowing of the Saddam Hussein government. And then, of course, you had the PNAC Circle. This was the Project for the New American Century. And PNAC was a massive Zionist think tank that had written a letter many years before 9/11 to the U.S. government calling for the overthrow of Saddam Hussein. So the overthrowing of Saddam Hussein was something that the Israelis wanted. It was something that American Zionists wanted. Again, we're going back to what Zionists wanted and how fulfilling Zionist desires actually has led Israel closer to its demise. So the Iraq War is justified by 9/11, even though Iraq had nothing to do with 9/11. America goes to Iraq. You guys know the full story. Saddam Hussein is hung. He was screaming Allahu Akbar, and even to the death, he showed defiance. And they killed him. So you had the Iraq War. Now, the Iraq War led to massive instability in the Middle East. Once the Americans pulled out, things got even more unstable. That instability boiled over into Syria, and America began to support Al-Qaeda and the Muslim Brotherhood and other rebellious elements within Syria. And they were doing this because they wanted to topple the Bashar al-Assad government. So you had the Syrian civil war. America and NATO was backing the Syrian revolution. Russia and Iran were backing the Bashar al-Assad government. That civil war led to, of course, massive instability, and that massive instability led to the refugee crisis. Again, the Syrian civil war was something that was desired by the Zionists. The Iraq war was something that was desired by the Zionists. And what the Zionists desired led to massive instability in the Middle East, and that led to a massive migrant crisis in Europe. That migrant crisis led to the rise of nationalism, the revival of nationalism in Germany and in really the rest of Europe. And that acted as a catalyst for Brexit because the British were afraid that if they did not sever from the European Union, that the United Kingdom would be overran by migrants from the Middle East. And so they voted to sever themselves from the European Union. Jeffrey Epstein, who was a Zionist, greatly supported Brexit and was applauding Brexit. And so you had Zionists who were clapping their hands for Brexit. Again, another Zionist desire was fulfilled. What did Brexit lead to? It led to the Germans saying, okay, well, now that the British are going to be leaving the European Union, it's time for the Germans to rise up to become the head of security for Europe and to become the protector for the European continent and to thereby become the most powerful military force in Europe. Now, fast forward to, just going back to Brexit, the reason why, or one of the reasons as to why the Germans said this was because the British were the biggest financiers for the security of the European Union. With the British voting for Brexit and with the British on their way to leaving the European Union, the German government said, okay, now is the time for us to really revive German military power and to become the most powerful military force in Europe. So, fast forward to just recently, Alex Karp, another Zionist, who is a massive business partner for Peter Thiel, to whom Jeffrey Epstein sent that email in which he was praising Brexit. Alex Karp does his manifesto declaring that both Germany and Japan need to intensify their remilitarization. Again, we have a Zionist, a powerful Zionist, supporting German nationalism and supporting German militarism. Now, why those countries? Out of all the countries in the world, this Zionist is supporting German nationalism and militarism and Japanese militarism. Why those countries? You're looking at some of the most genocidal countries in history. You're looking at the two countries that were horrifically murderous during the Second World War. I mean, it goes without saying that both the Germans and the Japanese together butchered tens of millions of people. The Japanese massacred the civilian populations of much of their neighbors, especially China and Korea. Germany massacred millions of people, Jews, Slavs, Gypsies, and others. And Germany's invasion of Russia led to the deaths of 30 million Russians. So why would you want to revive the militarism of those two countries unless, of course, you're an evil psychopath? Now, by supporting nationalism and militarism, the Israelis, really the Zionists, are leading Israel closer and closer to its demise, because with the rise of militarism, you have nationalism. And with the rise of nationalism, you have this awareness of Israel's power and influence and the desire of Israel to have influence in one's government. And so that leads to more and more hostility towards Israel. And if you look at Germany, for example, the German population is already overwhelmingly anti-Israel. The Germans are very dependent on the Strait of Hormuz to import its oil. And so with the Strait of Hormuz roughly closed, that, of course, has led to an oil or to an energy crisis in Germany. And that is leading to more and more Germans hating Israel. And so with the rise of Germany as this massive power, you're going to be seeing Germany rise up not just as a regional power, it's already a regional power, but as a global power, because it's going to be the leader of Europe's security. For the first time ever, we see Germany deploying troops into Lithuania. Germany's military-industrial complex is exploding tremendously. And so Germany is on its way to becoming a massive global power. And this is the mission of the United States. Steve Whitaker, America's ambassador to NATO, said that one of the visions of the United States is for Germany to become the most powerful military force in Europe. And so with the rise of Germany as a global power is going to also come along with that Germany's freedom to not listen to the Americans and to do whatever it is that they want. They will no longer be under the constraints of the American empire because they will be too powerful to obey a foreign power. Now, like I said, with the rise of nationalism comes more of an awareness of foreign interference, or at least the attempt of foreign countries to interfere in their politics. And so they will say, okay, well, the Israelis don't want us working with the Iranians. We know for a fact that in the early 2000s, the Germans wanted to buy natural gas from Iran, and the Israel lobby in both the United States and Germany objected to this, and the Germans backed off the deal. We know for a fact that the Germans supported the Iran deal and were the biggest European supporters of the Iran deal because they wanted to have trade with the Iranians. And when the Americans backed off from the Iran deal, the Germans objected. And I remember years ago, the foreign minister of Germany, Heiko Maas, saying that Germany needs to continue trade with Iran regardless of what America says, regardless of American objections. And then we have the Nord Stream 2 pipeline situation where the Germans said, okay, we're going to have this pipeline by which we can import Russian natural gas directly into Germany, and NATO destroyed the pipeline. So what do we see here? We see the Israel lobby and we see NATO controlling Germany, ruling over Germany. With the rise of nationalism comes the rise of an awareness of foreign interference and foreign control, and with that comes the rise of the desire for freedom from foreign control, and it comes and really you have this desire to have independence. And so the Germans are saying, why do the Americans control us? Why did the Americans destroy our Nord Stream 2 pipeline? Why do the Israelis have so much influence to where we can't even have commerce with the Iranians? We need to break the fetters of Zionist control. And eventually I think they will. And I think eventually they're going to be making a deal with the Iranians, and they're going to establish an alliance with the Iranians. And so you're going to have the rise of this Euro-Iranian alliance. And this will bring the Israelis closer to their demise because it will mean the Israelis losing Western support to Iran. And once you have this Euro-Iranian alliance, that will further spell the end of the Israelis because it will further spell the end of Zionist influence and power. The Zionists will no longer have the influence that they had over the Europeans. And so that will bring the Israelis closer to their demise because they will no longer have that Western support. And now you have this Iran war, and this Iran war is widening the chasm between the Americans and the Europeans. The Americans told the Europeans, hey, help us in this war. And the Europeans said, nope, this is not our war. And what was that? That was the Europeans refusing to abide by Zionist demands. The Zionists want for the Western world to help the Israelis and the Americans against the Iranians on the Strait of Hormuz. And the Europeans refused. The Germans refused. The Spanish expressed their defiance. The Italians expressed their defiance. And what was that? What is this? This is the rise of the Europeans against the Israelis. It's the rise of the Europeans against Zionist control and Zionist influence. And so the war in Iran has widened the chasm between the Americans and the Europeans, and it has gotten the Europeans to hate the Israelis even more. And what we are seeing right now is something that is not really that dissimilar to what was happening before the rise of Adolf Hitler in Europe. One of the things that got people to support Adolf Hitler was the idea that the Jews had too much power in Europe. This was a very strong belief that preceded the rise of Nazism in Europe. People were saying the Zionists have too much influence. In fact, Adolf Hitler himself said that the Zionists have excessive power and influence over the Americans. And the Germans saw themselves as, they didn't really see themselves exactly as imperialist, although they were definitely imperialistic. But they also saw themselves as rebels against the Americans and against American power. And ultimately, they saw themselves as rebels against Zionist power. Hitler said that the Jews had way too much influence over America's foreign policy. That's what people today are saying. And so you're seeing this rhyming of history. And the rise of that belief in Europe was really a part of the rise of Adolf Hitler. And it's something that really spelled the end of Israel, so to speak, in Europe. And it really foreshadowed the Holocaust. It foreshadowed the destruction of European Jewry. And Adolf Hitler had a prophecy. He said that if the Americans declare war on us, that will be the Jews declaring war on Germany. because it will be the Jews who will influence the Americans to go to war against us. This is what Adolf Hitler said. And so when it was quite obvious that there was a world war against Germany, the Germans intensified their genocide of the Jews, and they intensified their extermination machine and their slaughterhouse of European Jewry. And millions obviously were killed, as we all know. And so what do you see today? You see this rise in this belief that the Jews have too much power in America. You see this rise in this belief that it's time for the Europeans to free themselves of American control and ultimately to free themselves of Zionist control, because as the belief goes, as the argument goes, it's the Zionists who control America's foreign policy. And so with the rise of this belief will come the further rise of European defiance against Israel, and will come an even greater surge in anti-Israel sentiment in Europe. And the Israelis will have lost Western control. They will have lost Europe. They will lose Europe. And eventually they will lose the United States. And with that loss in Western support will come the further radicalization of Israel. Israel will become even more murderous. And because by this point the world will have abandoned Israel, the Muslim world will be crying for a savior for the Palestinians, and other countries will have no issues because at this point, like I said, Israel will have lost all of its foreign support. Nations will have no issues with rising up against the Israelis in the name of saving the Palestinians. And you're going to have the Turks with their Gazaps. You're going to have the Iranians. You're going to have other Islamic countries, other powerful Islamic countries like Indonesia, perhaps. And you may even have European countries rising up to join the Muslims against the Israelis. And just as the German Nazis made a pact with Muslims in the Balkans, and they made a pact with the Grand Muslim Mufti of Jerusalem, who you could say was a Palestinian, the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haji Mina Husseini, to go against the Jews, I think history will be rhyming again, and you will have a Euro-Islamic alliance against the Israelis. And history will rhyme. Anyway, you guys just heard some theology. God bless.